This is the 7th video of the series of the theory development in educational leadership. In this series of videos, I'll introduce the major events and theoretical views in each decade of the field of educational leadership. This video is about educational leadership in the 2000s. You can find the rest of the video series in the description section below. At the turn of the 21st century, educational leadership underwent a shift to a social justice-oriented theoretical framework. Since the middle of the 1990s, research on social justice leadership began to rise steadily. The social justice-oriented shift was situated in American social context and scientific development in other fields such as genomics. In the United States, the fight for education equality half a century ago has evolved to the fight for equity. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously on Brown v. Board of Education that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and ended racial segregation in schools. Back then, a racial justice perspective focused on education equality, treating every student the same, such as providing Black students with the equal access to education that white students had. Over time, the discussion has evolved to providing an equitable education to all students so that every student has an equitable chance for success. To achieve the equity goal, an equitable education system needs to provide students with the support they need and when they need it. Meanwhile, it was predicted that the United States would become a majority-minority nation within a generation. Against this social backdrop, social justice leadership became popular among educational leadership scholars. Social justice school leaders are those who are committed to improving the experience and outcomes of marginalized, disadvantaged students. This conceptualization of educational leadership at the beginning of the 21st century was very different from Frederick Taylor's principle of scientific management in the early 20th century that emphasized efficiency and effectiveness through impersonal authority. Meanwhile, the field of genomics made great advances. Prior to the late 1990s, paying too much attention to race was a mark of racism. With a new understanding of human genes and how those genes interact with the environment, ignoring racial difference was heralded as a dangerous perpetuation of racial inequality. In June 2000, President Bill Clinton famously remarked that the completion of a draft sequence of the human genome proved in genetic terms all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99.9% the same. With Clinton at his side, Craig Venter, a biotechnologist and businessman, commented, "I am happy that today, the only race we're talking about is the human race." Venter claimed that it was impossible to disambiguate the 5 major racial groups in the Genome Project's sample. Once translated into genomic data, race disappeared. Venter's narratives echoed Stephen Hawking's famous message, "One planet, one human race." Situated in this social context, educational leadership scholars increasingly use the construct of social justice leadership to take on hot-button racial issues and redress racism in education. They argue that educational leaders should play a significant role in eliminating inequitable opportunities between different groups and eventually contribute to building a just society. As a result, educational leaders should be movers and shakers who challenge power structure in society, foster social change, create a socially just school, and increase the achievement of all students. Social justice school leaders are expected to be action-oriented, transformative, committed, persistent, inclusive, democratic, relational, caring, reflective, and oriented toward a socially just pedagogy. Surprisingly, despite social justice being a popular topic in educational leadership, definitions of social justice remain elusive. There was no broad consensus concerning what social justice really meant. This is still the case to this day in 2022. When social justice was mentioned in the literature, it sometimes meant equality if referred to the value that everyone should have equal access to a society's resources and opportunities. Other times it referred to equity, as seen in a statement that in a socially just society, the distribution of resources is equitable and all members are physically and psychologically safe and secure. Moreover, social justice scholars in the field of educational leadership in the 2000s mostly focused on racial issues, mostly black students. They paid little attention to other marginalized groups in education, such as Hispanic students and students from other racial groups, students in special education, students with disabilities, linguistically diverse students, religious minorities, and students' sexual orientation. It was noting that the construct of social justice in the field of educational leadership in the 2000s was a Western explanation of social justice. Most scholars of social justice leadership were from English-speaking Western countries. A majority of scholars were from the United States, followed by the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada. The expansion of application for social justice leadership in schools did not take place until the 2010s, when scholars from other countries such as South Africa, Israel, and Turkey began to study and write about this topic. Still, what you read in literature was mostly a Western explanation for social justice. In the fields of leadership and organizational science, the research of justice did not focus on a broad societal context, but focused squarely on organizational context. The construct of organizational justice was defined as employee perceptions of fairness. It has at least three dimensions: distributive justice, that is the fairness of outcome distribution; procedural justice, that is the fairness of formal procedures underlying outcomes distribution; and interactional justice, that is the fairness of interpersonal treatment. The fourth dimension was added by other scholars to describe informational justice, providing people with explanations that convey information about why procedures are used in a certain way or why outcomes are distributed in a certain fashion. Nevertheless, justice means fairness. As one scholar of organizational justice put it explicitly, organizational justice scholars use the terms fairness and justice interchangeably. The focus on fairness was probably influenced by empirical findings on fairness from different fields in the 1990s and the 2000s. In economics, it was argued that humans were averse to unfairness. In a team setting, unfairness occurred when free riders, those who drink water but not carry water, were allowed without punishment to exploit other team members' efforts. Given people's aversion to unfairness, if you want to ensure cooperation in your team, it is important for you to punish free riders even when the punishment is costly. In primatology, Sarah Brosnan and Franz de Waal, who studied primates, published an article in Nature with a snappy title, "Monkeys Reject Unequal Pay." Monkeys refuse to cooperate when their previous cooperation was rewarded unfairly. Around the same time, neuroscientific findings offered biological explanations for humans' universally innate preference for fairness. Being treated fairly activated the reward system in human brains, the very dopaminergic reward system that was activated as a response to physical pleasure. Fairness was intrinsically rewarding to people. If you want to motivate people, you'd better treat people fairly. On the other hand, unfair treatment is demoralizing. Take some time to observe how children behave when they feel they are treated unfairly. You can write down their behavioral responses to unfair treatment. Treated unfairly, adults behave in a similar way. In organizations, unfair treatment takes in many shapes and forms, including but not limited to rewarding someone who claims to have completed a task but actually has not, being passed over for promotion when someone has unequivocal merit as a compromise for nepotism or cronyism under the disguise of trust, and exerting undue influence over the due process in organizations. What are other unfair treatments you've encountered or observed in your organization? Many organizational justice scholars use the fairness and justice interchangeably, but they may have different definitions of fairness. Take distributive justice as an example. For some scholars, fairness meant equality, for example, an equal distribution. For others, it meant equity, an equitable distribution based on need, effort, and merit. Either way, the pursuit of organizational justice went against the psychological effect of power. Having power or experiencing power was associated with a strong sense of entitlement, a belief of deserving privileges or special treatment, which run counter to distributive justice and procedural justice. Who is more likely to occupy a corner office? Are they high-power people or low-power people? Who is likely to exert power and pressure over a hiring process? Moreover, having power has also been linked to more demeaning behavior and the strong tendency of aggression, which ran counter to interactional justice. Who is more likely to say, "Do you know who I am?" Back to education. In 2001, George W. Bush became the President of the United States. The Republican Party abandoned the Reagan administration's policy on reducing and eliminating federal influence on education. Instead, the Republican Party embraced the view that the federal government should have an active role in education. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was passed in 1965, was reauthorized in 2001. The 2001 Esea Reauthorization was the No Child Left Behind Act. The No Child Left Behind Act substantially limited states' decision-making power over testing and school improvement. It required states to test students in reading and mathematics, establish proficiency standards, and track and report school-wide progress toward an ultimate goal of 100% proficiency for all students by the end of the 2013 and 2014 school year. The No Child Left Behind pushed high-stakes test-based accountability and expanded the federal control on education. With less power on education, states with the support of teacher unions and interest groups had grown dissatisfied. By 2008, 8 states had defied the No Child Left Behind Act by introducing legislation in direct opposition to the No Child Left Behind Act. And 30 states introduced or passed legislation asking Congress to modify the No Child Left Behind Act. In 2007, ESEA was supposed to be reauthorized again. The Bush administration's effort to reauthorize ESEA was pushed back by Congress, with a Democratic majority in both bodies of Congress. Both of the legislative and executive branches of the government agreed that the No Child Left Behind Act was flawed, but disagreed with how to fix it. In July 2009, the Obama administration announced $4.35 billion raised to the TOP program, a competitive grant that states competed for funding to adopt standards and assessment, improve teacher and principal effectiveness, and turn around low-performing schools. In March 2010, the Obama administration presented Congress with a blueprint for ESEA reauthorization, proposing creating a teacher evaluation system tied to student growth. But the proposal received lukewarm support from Congress. The stalemate on ESEA reauthorization led to failure to fix the perceived shortcomings of the No Child Left Behind Act in a timely manner. ESEA was not reauthorized until 2015 in President Obama's second term. The increased federal control over education laid the foundation for the release of the Common Core state standards in 2010, the national standards outlining the knowledge and skills that students in grades K-12 are expected to learn in English language arts and mathematics. The dominant theories of educational leadership in the 1990s remained popular in the 2000s. They include transformational leadership, instructional leadership, and organizational culture. But there was a shift of focus. Prior to the 2000s, the primary conceptualization of educational leadership focused on one individual leader, such as school principal and a district superintendent. In the 2000s, more leadership conceptualizations expanded from an individual to a group. Social network theory was used to study educational leadership as a collective entity. Other leadership conceptualizations include shared leadership, teacher leadership, distributed leadership, and collaborative leadership. With the introduction of those new terms to the field of educational leadership, some questions loomed large. What were the fundamental differences that distinguish one term from another? Was there a lot of theoretical overlap among them? That's a matter of debate. Scholars can always come up with justifications for using different terms. Meanwhile, in the broad field of leadership, Burnett Tapper proposed an alternative conceptualization of leadership, abusive supervision. The construct of abusive supervision had already been studied in earlier decades, such as abusive behavior, emotional abuse, and petty tyrants in the workplace. Tapper's theoretical contribution was that he offered a strong and clear definition. Abusive supervision was defined as subordinate perceptions of the extent to which supervisors engage in the sustained display of hostile verbal and nonverbal behaviors, excluding physical contact. Tapper made it clear that whether a supervisor is abusive or not depends on subordinates' subjective evaluation. The same behavior can be considered in some contexts as abusive and non-abusive in another context. Those behaviors include, but not limited to, telling you your ideas are stupid, being insensitive to your feelings, reminding you of your past mistakes, being picked on, and expressing anger at you when your supervisor is mad for another reason. Moreover, the very same behavior can be viewed by some subordinates as abusive and non-abusive by others. This definition still remains popular in the leadership research community. Of course, the construct of abusive supervision attracted criticism. Some argue that abusive supervision conflated subordinates' evaluation of leaders' behaviors was the existence of those behaviors. 7 years after Tapper's article on abusive supervision was published, the construct of destructive leadership was proposed. It was defined as the systematic and repeated behavior by a leader, supervisor, or manager that violates the legitimate interest of the organization by undermining and/or sabotage the organization's goals, tasks, resources, and effectiveness and/or the motivation, well-being, or job satisfaction of subordinates. According to the authors, this definition of destructive leadership was more inclusive than abusive supervision. First, while abusive supervision did not include physical contact, destructive leadership included physical aggression. Second, while abusive supervision focused on supervisors' behaviors directed at subordinates, destructive leadership included supervisors' behaviors directed toward the organization, such as undermining or sabotaging the collective goal of organization by prioritizing self-serving interests. For example, destructive leaders use public funds to cover personal expenses. Destructive leaders were like human locusts, wreaking havoc in one organization and moving on to the next. Unfortunately, they tended to use their short-lived success in previous organization to secure a more powerful position in the next organization. Both of the conceptualizations of abusive supervision and destructive leadership focused on the dark side of leadership. They stood in sharp contrast in dominant conceptualization in educational leadership that focused on the positive side of leadership, such as being transformational, instructional, socially just, and ethical. The research on destructive leadership in the context of school settings was scattered. Most of the research on school principals' mistreatment of teachers was conducted by Joseph Blase and Joe Blase. Unfortunately, the scant attention to destructive leadership in educational system did not reflect the rare existence of destructive leadership. On the contrary, it was common to see some educational leaders abuse of power and mistreatment of teachers. In this video, I introduce the theory development of educational leadership in the 2000s. The research on social justice leadership was on the rise. Despite the elusive definition of justice in educational leadership literature, the dominant theories of educational leadership in the 1990s remained popular in the 2000s. They include transformational leadership, instructional leadership, and organizational culture. In the broader field of leadership and organizational science, the constructs of abusive supervision and destructive leadership were proposed. Although there was little attention to the dark side of leadership in the field of educational leadership, the reported evidence suggested that it was common to see some educational leaders abuse of power and mistreatment of teachers. If you want to know more about how to build a theoretical framework for your research, I have published a book titled Demystify Theories, a workbook for developing theoretical frameworks of educational leadership research. The link of the book is in the description below.